I have a friend who's a vegetarian and yet somehow manages to eat a lot of meat and still be a vegetarian. And I have another friend who does sex work and yet maintains her chastity somehow. And oh yeah, I know a politician who lives down the road who's actually an honest man, believe it or not. Yeah, I'm just being facetious. None of these people exist because all these three examples I mentioned are what we call oxymorons, which means basically an idea in literature that is an idea that is comprised of two contrasting terms, usually an adjective and a noun that are mutually exclusive. For example, an honest politician, or a virgin prostitute, or a carnivorous vegetarian. You see what I mean? So there's a trend of socialists or communists who call themselves socialists and communists and yet describe themselves at the same time as conservative communists or conservative socialists. And the word that people use to describe these people on Twitter is the acronym known as petsocs, or abbreviation, known as petsocs. Okay, first of all, while we fully acknowledge the fact that, liberalism and wokeism is often used in order to manufacture consent against certain groups of people in order to serve imperialist ambitions. Like, for example, when the neoliberals in the West use woke culture in order to demonize the Palestinians as being backward and savage and barbaric, and the Israelis as being holy and sanctimonious and progressive, in order to, that the term for it is known as pinkwashing. The fact of the matter is that, yes, the idea, the most socialists in the world accept that imperialism is the highest form of capitalism, right? And the primary contradiction that most socialists in the world accept is imperialism. Having said that, however, while I acknowledge that nations should have a right to develop organically and decide their own course and basically decide their own fate, change should not be forced from outside, because often there is a vested interest in forcing that change, right? Like, nobody cared, for instance, about human rights and democracy in China during the century of humiliation, until, of course, China started becoming richer, and then people in the West, those Westoid imperialists, suddenly started behaving like woke SJWs, pretending to give so much of a damn about Queen Elizabeth's Oriental subjects, when in reality, during the century of humiliation, they were calling the Chinese like the sick man of Asia, right? So, yeah, I acknowledge that ID poll, like gay rights, trans rights, women's rights, is often used in order to manufacture consent against groups of people who may not be as aware as some others are on these issues. ID poll is used like a sharp knife, basically. It kills without drawing blood, basically. So that's why many people in communist and socialist spheres, especially the anti-imperialist ones, in fact, if you follow the teachings of Marxist Leninism, you have to acknowledge the fact that imperialism is the primary contradiction. And basically, imperialism should be what is focused on. Anti-imperialism is what should be focused on as the prime objective, because you cannot dismantle capitalism without first dismantling imperialism, because imperialism is the grease that runs the car known as capitalism. And if you cannot stop the car unless you take away the oil first, you know. But that's what most communists in the world and socialists in the world, I'm not a communist, I'm a socialist, but I'm anti-imperialist as well, accept, right? But here's the thing. While we fully acknowledge that the working class is comprised not only of woke liberal or woke leftist people, but also people who may have socially conservative views, and if you don't stand for them, you don't stand for the working class, because freedom is merely privilege extended unless enjoyed by one and all, right? So if you don't stick up for the working class people who don't share your views, then you've never really cared for the working class. If you only care for the ones who share your opinions, right? But having said that, transgendered people, gay people, women, vulnerable minorities are also part of the working class. And so we come to the point when we have to start to wonder, right? What is the balance that we draw? What is the balance that we draw between, you know, not falling into the trap of ID poll, you know, and creating divisions between the working people of the world, right? Yeah, tribalistic divisions, and preserving, or rather protecting the rights of minorities, women, LGBT folk as well, who are also part of the working class, right? And their rights, you know, as I've said, freedom is merely privilege extended unless enjoyed by one and all, right? Now, that's not what I'm here to talk about, although that's food for thought for another video. I'm here to talk about a group of so-called communists and socialists who say that they are communists and socialists, but who know Marxist Leninist theory as well as the back of their hand. You'll find a lot of them on Twitter. They can quote exactly, they can quote Marx and Lenin off the top of their head. But in reality, do not hold left-wing, do not hold socialist or communist views, and are merely reactionaries in socialist garb, right? Just like Lee Kuan Yew was a legalist in Confucian garb, right? I'm not putting down Lee Kuan Yew. I'm saying that Lee Kuan Yew called himself a Confucian, but was more of a legalist. Many of these LARPers, you know, have basically infiltrated the ranks of communists and socialists around the world and are now pretending to be communists and socialists and using their knowledge of Marxism, Leninism as proof that they are part of the Internationale, but in fact are basically wolves in sheep's clothing, right? How do you recognize these people? Well, basically, you can usually spot them by the fact that they just as easily spout right-wing reactionary talking points. There's no difference between them and Thomas Sowell or Ben Shapiro, you know what I mean? Except for the fact that, you know, they're using the title of communist or the title of socialist, you know, people like Haas or people like that, yeah. But I don't really know so much about Haas. I'm talking about these groups that you'll find on Twitter that will not call themselves conservatives, because Haas identifies as a conservative, of course, and that is an irreconcilable contradiction between, you know, because if you're a conservative communist, then obviously you haven't read Marx, or you have only read Marx selectively, because what are you trying to conserve? Marx is trying to dismantle the traditional family unit and basically he's trying to dismantle traditional society, right? I dare not call myself a Marxist because I'm a Confucian. I can call myself a socialist, although I'm pretty left-wing on a lot of issues, like, you know, if you think about me in a Western sense, left-wing in a Western sense, such as believing that it's not a crime to love someone, although in Asian culture, in classical Asian culture, that's just normal, right? Not being homophobic is left-wing in a Western sense, a modern Western sense, but in classical Asian culture, not being homophobic is just normal, right? Because we were pretty accepting of gays until the missionaries showed up and started telling us that we were degenerate and depraved because we accepted all these things. And now they're turning around and telling us that we're backward because we happen to be socially conservative because of the missionaries in the first place that showed up on our shores. I've always found these people known as the petsocs, or rather patriotic socialists, to be very, very sus. People saying things like, well, don't blame, I'm a socialist. I believe in the works of Marx and Lenin and Engels, but at the same time, I don't like, I don't like all these weaklings, blaming society and blaming capitalism for their personal failure. And basically, besides being able to quote from Marx and Lenin and Engels by heart and calling themselves socialists, there's very little difference between them and a typical bootstraps boomer like Thomas Sowell. Sowell is actually he's actually a silent generation character. So the thing is, if you have the mentality of a bootstraps boomer and you have no compassion for the most downtrodden members of society, and when somebody laments about how hard their life is because of capitalism, you tell them, shut up, don't complain, don't blame capitalism for your first personal failures. Why? What the fuck are you doing calling yourself a communist or a socialist if you are cruel and callous and unkind to the people who need your help, right? I'm not even a communist, but I can recognize a fake communist when I see one. If you are cruel to the very people you profess to be helping, if you have no empathy or compassion for them, what use is it being able to quote Marx or Lenin by the book? You're basically to socialism or communism. It is like Claude Frollo, from Hunchback of Notre Dame, to Christianity. You see, there are a lot of people who call themselves Christians but don't practice Christ's teachings. So you're going to have to do a little bit better than that. And we're going to have a bit more standards, right? We're going to need to pull up our standards a little bit and not simply accept that there's going to be such a wide diversity of opinions in our socialist or communist ranks. Because if people are using reactionary talking points, if people are using, then, well, I don't think that sort of thing, I think that sort of thing ought to be treated with quite a bit of suspicion, you know what I mean? It's you know what I mean? You can't call yourself, like, for example, you can't call yourself a Muslim and be eating pork, right? And drinking alcohol, right? Well, you can, you just be a hypocrite in that regard. So you cannot call yourself a communist or a socialist and at the same time have the exact same ideology as Ben Shapiro or Thomas Sowell, right? You have to have compassion for the downtrodden. That's what you are, right? Of course, and if you are homophobic or transphobic or whatever, because that happened to be your upbringing, that's not your fault, right? But you do have to make a conscious effort to be better, So the idea that some socialists on Twitter had of using Trump's FBI raid as a chance to try and court right-wing fascists on to the socialist movement was a horrible, horrible idea, right? The idea is to overthrow fascism, not get the fascists on board, right? You see what I mean? Now, I may not be a communist, but I hate fascists just as much as you, right? True, I hate fascists just as much as I hate, just as much as true communists hate them. So, I'm a socialist. But the thing is, the idea, I repeat, is to overthrow fascism, not get the fascists on board, right? Because then the fascists can pretend to be on your side, but at the end of the day, working well with reactionaries has never, ever, ever aided the cause of socialists. Because the reactionary, making a deal with a reactionary, is like making a deal with the devil. He will never, ever accept a deal with you unless he is sure that he will come out on top and you at the bottom. He will be your dom and you will be his bitch. That is the whole point of the reactionary. What do you think happened to Chin Peng after he worked together with the Brits to fight the Japanese? At the end of it, they labeled him and his band a band of terrorists and murderers and hunted him like a dog, right? What happened to Lim Chin Siong when Lim Chin Siong tried to work with Lee Kuan Yew? What happened at the end? In order to please the Tunku, and this is not putting down the Tunku, but Tunku was at the time, Tunku Abdul Rahman, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, was staunchly anti-communist, right? Staunchly anti-communist. Lee Kuan Yew had no qualms about locking up Lim Chin Siong. Lim Chin Siong, the socialist leader of Singapore in the 60s, right? Even though they were working together, collaborating for a common goal, Lee Kuan Yew had no problem throwing Lim Chin Siong under the bus in Operation Coldstore. Read up about it. Whenever you work together with fascists or reactionaries, whenever you let them on board, it's always going to end well. It's not going to end well for you, right? So, remember, while we respect a nation's right to self-determination, our transgendered LGBT people, whatever, or women, they are still our allies, right? They are still part of the working class, right? So, if you knowingly accept people into the movement who want to murder your transgendered or LGBT allies, then you are putting them in jeopardy, right? And if you let people like Ben Shapiro or Thomas Sowell into the movement, and you let them keep their reactionary views, and you don't make it a condition that they have to improve and they have to basically become better, then it becomes a slippery slope. The movement starts getting not tailed, but rather then the most aggressive reactionaries will start carrying out what's known as commandism, basically turning the movement distorting the meaning of communism and socialism, which is left-wing in nature, distorting it altogether, and basically pushing society back to the traditional, old-fashioned status quo. Because the idea of socialism and communism is a left-wing idea. Because the idea is to overthrow the status quo, right? Now, socialists and communists disagree in that regard, to which extent the status quo ought to be overthrown. Many people who think they're communists are really socialists because they still want to preserve the traditional family unit, right? Like I do. I like the Confucian multi-generational family unit. So I dare not call myself a communist because communist means you're going to overthrow the entire family structure and eventually create a classless, moneyless society. But that's not what socialists are aiming for. But at the same time, no matter whether you're socialist or communist, you're still left-wing. You are still implementing social change. If you don't want to implement social change, but you want to use the title, hang it around your neck, you want to wear the title like a piece of jewelry, because it's cool to be a communist, but you have the same reactionary right-wing talking points, don't call yourself one, man. You're just being a larper. In fact, I respect you more if you call yourself a capitalist reactionary than if you call yourself a communist or socialist, because you're not, okay? And yes, while we acknowledge the right of nations to develop their own course, to chart their own course, and basically develop their own culture organically without foreign interference, nevertheless, we should try our best to create awareness, awareness about LGBT issues, not force it down people's throats, but to educate people about the LGBT community. Whether they accept it or not is their own business, okay? But if you're not educating people, if you're not making people aware of the plight of LGBT people, and basically you're using rugged individualism talking points, like some of the fellas on Twitter, saying, I'm a socialist, but I don't blame capitalism for my personal failures, then don't call yourself one, okay? Don't call yourself one. Because the idea is, because if you don't have compassion for a fellow working class person, then you are really a reactionary, LARPing as a socialist. So it's easy to call yourself anything in the world, right? Hitler called himself a national socialist. Was Hitler a socialist? In the conventional way we accept the word socialism, he was a social Darwinist. But his idea was bread and work, right? Like Hitler could also say, I stand up for the working class. See, I'm going to improve your life. I'm going to give you bread and work. But I'm going to cull the weaklings as well, because weaklings are worth less than dirt in my eyes. If you're that type of socialist, fuck off. Fuck off. Because we don't want national socialists in our movement, yeah? We want real socialists who want to improve the human condition, not social Darwinists trying to implement change, not social Darwinists trying to cull the weaklings, right? Basically, who only want to practice socialism for people that they deem are worthy, while the unworthy in their eyes get culled. That's not the type of socialism you want. That's fascism, right? And contempt for the weak is a common trend in fascism, right? So, do be careful. Do be careful that you don't let in reactionaries and all sorts of weirdos into the movement. But when I say weirdos, I'm not referring to the LGBT community here, so don't come and slag me for that. Don't let in any kind of weirdo into the movement, okay? Be selective about who you let in. And if people who come from traditional families, like, if you're traditional Muslim or traditional Christian, that's okay. But you have to be open in order to try and see the point of view of perhaps LGBT people or vulnerable groups, okay? If not, then I'm just saying there needs to be standards that are maintained, because without standards, a movement can easily slip into disarray, right? And easily regress into fascism.